5 years later, I found myself face to face with my husband after he had caught me cheating with my boss. It had been 5 long and grueling years since my world fell apart. Since Ethan, my husband and the man I once considered my soulmate, discovered me in the arms of another man, Michael, my boss. The betrayal was so monumental that it shattered not only Ethan, but also the life we had carefully built over a decade. I replayed that night over and over in my mind. Ethan's silent shock, his trembling hands clutching the takeout bag he had brought for me, and the way his eyes seemed to lose their spark when he saw Michael and me in that compromising position. He didn't yell, he didn't lash out. He simply stood there, staring at me as though I were a stranger, before turning and walking away. The divorce was inevitable. Ethan refused to speak to me throughout the entire process, and I couldn't blame him. I signed the papers in tears, knowing I had no right to fight for anything, not our home, not our memories, and certainly not him. When it was all finalized, I left town, unable to bear the weight of my mistakes or the judgment of our mutual friends. For the next few years, I focused on rebuilding my life. Therapy became my sanctuary, a place where I analyzed the cracks in my marriage and confronted the darker parts of myself that had led to my infidelity. It wasn't just about the act of cheating. It was about the loneliness, the fear of not being enough, and the desperate need for validation that I sought from Michael. I had destroyed the most meaningful part of my life, and no amount of self-reflection could undo that. The guilt consumed me every single day, but what hurt the most wasn't the act itself. It was a realization of how deeply Ethan had loved me in a way I had never fully appreciated. He was patient, kind, and supportive, always there when I needed him. He had been my rock, the person I could rely on for everything, and yet I had betrayed him. I had turned my back on everything we had built and everything we had fought for together. Michael had been nothing more than a fleeting escape, a brief moment of validation in an otherwise hollow space. But that fleeting escape came at the cost of losing the love of my life. When I received the wedding invitation, I almost didn't open it. It was from Sarah, one of Ethan's close friends who had always been kind to me. Seeing her name brought back a flood of memories. Dinners, vacations, laughter. It felt like a lifetime ago. I hesitated as I opened the envelope, and when I saw the location, my stomach sank. The wedding was to be held at the same church where Ethan and I had exchanged our vows. A part of me wanted to rip the invitation in half and throw it away. But another part of me, the part that longed for closure, felt an inexplicable pull to attend. I had never had the chance to properly apologize to Ethan or say goodbye, and now, here was my opportunity. The idea of attending the wedding was both terrifying and oddly enticing. I was still haunted by the memories of our time together, and I knew this could either bring me closer to healing or serve as yet another painful reminder of my failures. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. On the day of the wedding, I felt like a ghost walking through the corridors of my past. The church looked almost exactly as it had on my wedding day. The same stained glass windows, the same soft glow of candles, the same faint scent of aged wood and roses. Every corner of that sacred place seemed to echo with fragments of my memories with Ethan. I scanned the crowd nervously, feeling torn between hoping and dreading that he might be there. And then I saw him. Ethan. He was seated near the front, effortlessly handsome in a dark suit. His hair had a touch more gray, but his posture was as confident as ever. He was talking to a woman with striking red hair, who laughed at something he said, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. My stomach twisted with a knot of jealousy and regret. The woman with him was stunning, elegant, poised, and everything I felt I wasn't in that moment. A wave of bitterness and self-loathing swept over me. Was she the one who had taken my place in his heart? Did she bring him happiness in a way I never could? I tried to slip into a pew unnoticed, but my movement caught Ethan's attention. Our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. His expression was unreadable, neither angry nor warm, just quiet recognition. I wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words refused to come. I didn't deserve his forgiveness, not after everything I had done. So I lowered my head and focused on the ceremony, silently grappling with the weight of my emotions. When the vows were exchanged and the reception began, I lingered near the exit, debating whether to leave before the emotions became too overwhelming. But fate seemed to have other plans. "Clara," Ethan's voice called softly behind me. I froze, my heart racing as I turned to face him. There he was, standing just a few feet away, looking so much like the man I had once loved. The ache in my chest was almost unbearable. "Ethan," I managed to say, my voice trembling and revealing the storm of emotions raging inside me. Up close, Ethan was even more striking than I remembered. There was an air of maturity about him, a calmness that I envied. He wasn't the same man I had left behind. There was a strength in him now, a quiet resilience. He had endured and moved on, while I had been trapped in my regret. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone polite but distant, as if we were strangers and not two people who had once shared years of love and trust. "Neither did I admitted. I wasn't sure it was a good idea to come, to be honest." "I see," Ethan replied with a slight nod, his gaze steady but still unreadable. "So, you're well?" I asked, swallowing hard and struggling to keep my composure. "I'm doing better, I guess. Therapy has helped," I said, my voice uneven. I'm trying to make sense of everything. The words felt hollow, like an apology I didn't know how to express. "I'm glad to hear that," Ethan replied, his tone calm but distant. There was no trace of the anger or pain that had consumed him years ago when he caught me with Michael. I couldn't tell if that meant he had forgiven me or if he simply didn't care anymore. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," I whispered, the weight of years of regret pressing down on me. "For everything. I was selfish, and I destroyed us. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know how truly sorry I am. I ruined the best thing I ever had." Ethan studied me for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, Clara," he said honestly, "but I've made peace with what happened. I had to. It took time, a lot of time. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt like hell, but it's in the past now. I've moved on." His gaze shifted toward the woman with the red hair, who was now chatting animatedly with someone near the dance floor. "I found peace," he added. A pang of jealousy rose within me, but I quickly pushed it aside. I had no right to feel that way anymore. "I never stopped loving you," I admitted quietly. I wasn't the person you deserved." Ethan's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the man I once knew. But then it faded, replaced by something else, something I couldn't name but recognize as closure. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Clara," Ethan said, his voice gentle yet firm. "You deserve that, but it won't be with me." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. He was right. I had lost him, and no amount of regret could ever change that. As I stood there, facing the man I had once loved so deeply, I realized something important. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't erase the mistakes I had made or revive the love we had lost. But I could learn from it. I could strive to be a better person. Someone who no longer sought validation from others. Someone strong enough to stand on her own 2 feet and move forward without the constant shadow of guilt. With that thought, I turned and walked away, leaving the past where it belonged. It was time to start over. "It's been a long time," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence. "It has," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The years had passed, but in this moment, it felt like no time at all. We stood there in the dim light. Two people who had once shared everything, now facing each other as strangers. Memories lingered between us, heavy and unspoken. There was an awkward pause, the weight of our shared history hanging in the air like a thick curtain, undeniable and suffocating. I didn't know what to say or how to begin. The years had changed us, but the past clung to us like a shadow, refusing to let go. "Do you want to talk?" Ethan finally asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. I wasn't expecting the question, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Yeah, I said, my voice trembling as I fought to hold back tears. I had longed for this moment in some strange, twisted way. But now that it was here, I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. We stepped outside, away from the noise and laughter of the reception. The evening air was cool, and I wrapped my arms around myself, searching for comfort. For a moment, we stood in silence, the muffled sounds of the party fading into the background. It felt as though we were standing on the edge of something deep and painful. Neither of us ready to take the first step. "I heard you left town," Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence like a ripple across still water. "I did," I replied, taking a deep breath. The crisp night air made my skin tingle. I couldn't stay. Everything reminded me of what I'd done. It was like living in a house full of ghosts, each one more painful than the last. Ethan's eyes softened, though his expression remained unreadable. "And Michael?" he asked, his tone steady, as though bracing himself for my answer. "It ended shortly after everything," I confessed, the words heavy as they left my lips. "It was never real, Ethan. It was a mistake, a horrible, selfish mistake. I thought it would fill the emptiness I felt, but it only made everything worse." Ethan's jaw tightened, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, pain, or perhaps both. For a moment he said nothing, and the weight of the truth settled between us. I thought he might walk away, that he wouldn't be able to bear hearing it. But instead, he spoke again, his voice low as if the words were difficult to say. "I spent years trying to figure out what I did wrong," he began. "I kept asking myself if I wasn't enough for you, if there was something I could have done differently. I thought maybe I missed something. I thought maybe I was the one who failed." Tears filled my eyes as I listened to his words, and I struggled to keep them from falling. "It wasn't you, Ethan," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It was me. I was scared and insecure, and I let my fears destroy everything. You were more than enough. I was just too blind to see it." He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze intense, a mix of sadness and something else I couldn't quite define, acceptance, perhaps. It was hard to read him now, but it was clear he had moved on. For a brief moment, I wondered if I could ever truly do the same. "I've moved on, Clara," he said at last, breaking the silence. His tone was calm, but there was finality in his words. "It wasn't easy, but I had to. You can't live in the past forever." I nodded, my chest aching at his words. I had always known he would move on, but hearing him say it aloud felt like a blow to my heart. Still, I managed to force a small smile. "I'm glad," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You deserve to be happy, Ethan. You always did." He hesitated for a moment, his tone softening as he asked, "And you? Have you found peace?" The question hit harder than I had expected. I wanted to say yes, to tell him everything was fine and that I had figured it all out. But the truth was far from that. "I'm trying," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I've spent the last 5 years trying to understand myself, trying to forgive myself. It's a work in progress. I don't know if I'll ever fully find peace, but I'm learning to accept that maybe that's okay." We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. The world around us faded away, the faint sound of music from the reception hall drifting through the windows, distant and insignificant. All that mattered was the weight of our conversation, the fragile thread of connection between us that stretched but didn't quite break. "I'm glad we talked," Ethan said finally, his voice low and sincere. "I think I needed this more than I realized." "Me too," I whispered. It felt as though a heavy burden had been lifted, but I knew the journey wasn't over yet. "I'm so sorry for everything, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. "I hope you know that. I hope you know how much I regret the way things ended." "I do," he replied with a small, knowing smile. There was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, just a quiet understanding. Both of us had been shaped by the past, but we no longer had to let it define us. I hope you find happiness, Clara, he said gently. His voice was soft but firm. You deserve it. We both do. A lump formed in my throat at his words, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I could speak. But somehow, I managed to say what I needed to. Thank you, I whispered. I hope you find everything you've been searching for too. He gave me one last look, a mixture of fondness and something else, perhaps acceptance, before turning and walking back toward the reception. I watched him go, feeling an unexpected sense of closure. It was like a door closing, but not in the way I had imagined. For years, I had carried the weight of guilt and regret, convinced that I had destroyed everything beyond repair. But in that moment, standing in the cool night air, I realized that forgiveness, both his and my own, was the first step toward healing. I had lost Ethan because of my own mistakes, but now I understood something important. Healing didn't mean trying to undo the past. It meant moving forward. As I stood there, watching him disappear into the warm glow of the reception hall, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could start moving forward too. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I could still find a path to happiness.